Thank you very much. I'm gonna send you on a tour through the land of electronic health records. So I have been using electronic health records for more than 20 years to do research, and I have published around 250 papers based on electronic health records. I have many research interests, but I have listed a few here. So I've done research on mental health, women's health, pharmacoepidemiology, and a lot of my work on electronic health records has also led to development of new methods. So today I would first give you a definition of electronic health records. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between primary studies and electronic health records studies. Then I will give you a few examples of work, not only my own work, but also work others have done. And before I move on to talk about the limitations, I want to talk about the strengths and some of the opportunities we have with electronic health records. And then I put at the end and say it may be the future of epidemiology. So when we talk about electronic health records, there are many different types. So some records will come from specific settings: primary care, secondary care, tertiary care, laboratory results, prescription records. And I'm sure you can come up with even more settings where you will have electronic health records in the country where you come from. In some countries, they're used for clinical management. And in other countries, they're used as from a health insurance perspective or reimbursement records. And sometimes they are administrative records. Here I consider them under the umbrella electronic health records. So what is the difference between primary studies and electronic health record studies? So primary studies are data that are collected for research purpose, and the study design is defined before data collection. So for example, a randomized controlled trial, a cohort study, a case control study, and often data are collected at specific time points. And you may think about various cohort studies. The British Regional Heart Study was started in the 70s and collected data of men and looked at cardiovascular outcome. Or there are many, many different cohort studies. And there are, of course, many different randomized controlled trials that are used to address a specific question. Then you have electronic health record studies, and their data are not collected for research purpose. And the study design is not defined at data collection. Rather, they are often designed after data collection. And data are collected for a very different reason. So they may be collected for clinical care, management, administrative purpose, or financial purpose. I will now give you a few examples of electronic health record research. So I will be talking about the MMR vaccine and autism, which have now become very relevant in some countries more recently. I'll talk a little bit about a study on protective effects of antibiotics against serious complications of common respiratory tract infections. And then I will also talk about medicines prescribed in pregnancy. So some of you may remember this, others may not. But it was a case study that was published back in 1998. And it was published by a Dr. Wakefield, and he actually presented his result in the seminar room in our department. He wasn't a part of that department, but his findings were presented there. And it caused some concern on measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR vaccine, that it might cause autism. His original paper was published in The Lancet, and as you can see, if you search for this paper, it will mention that it was later retracted. But before that, it was in 1998, and this is the MMR vaccine uptake. And as you can see, that there was an increase, and it was in London, it wasn't quite as high, but it was above 19 in England. After this publication, the uptake of MMR fell sharply. Then the Danes came along, and they published a electronic health record study in 2002. And that was a cohort study of all children born in Denmark between 91 and up to 98. And it is based on registry data, and they had 500,000 children in that cohort study. And 82% of them received a vaccine, and they found the relative risk of autism was 0.92, but with confidence intervals around 1. So they found no association between MMR and vaccine. That was published in one of the most prominent journals, New England Journal of Medicine. But you don't just need one study. So the people in UK did another study with data from the UK Primary Care, GPRD, which is now called CPRD, and they did a matched control study. And they had cases, about 1,300, and controls, about 40,500. And again, they found an odds ratio that suggested that there was no association. And I believe that some of these studies were actually groundbreaking, and that they led to a retraction of the original paper suggesting that there was an association. But I just want you to take a moment to think about how would we have been able to address this question without electronic health records. If we had traditional cohort study, recruitment could be difficult because parents may not want to enter their child into a study where you would have been uncertain about the outcome. It would be expensive, and it would have taken a long time to conduct. And in the meantime, there would have been children potentially dying of, for example, measles. They could have done a case control study, but again, also identifying controls might have been difficult. So this is just one example of how you can use electronic health record to answer epidemiological questions. I'm now going to give you a few other examples. So this is one of the first papers I published when I started my journey using electronic health records. So we were looking at protective effects of antibiotics against serious complications. So again, we used GPRD, and here we had nearly 3.4 million episodes of respiratory tract infections. And we were interested to see if there was a serious complication in the months after diagnosis. But what we found was that having a serious complication after an upper respiratory tract infection is rare. So you would need to treat at least 4,000 people to prevent one serious complication. On the other hand, risk of pneumonia after a chest infection was high, and in particular in elderly people. And here we only needed to treat 39 of people who were aged more than 65, and around 100 in younger age groups. So again, this study was later also used to inform antibiotic prescribing in UK, and also demonstrate that you may not want to have exactly the same approach in every case. You have to risk stratify. So electronic health records made this study possible. Again, we had a very large sample size, and it would have been very difficult to do if we were to set up a primary study. I'm sending you on a whistle-stop tour here, because now we're going to talk about medicines prescribed in pregnancy. And again, I'm sure there will be some people in this room who remember what thalidomide is. But I have also been on courses where I had to remind people, because not everybody were born more than 50 years ago. But the drug was first sold in Germany in 1957 as a wonder drug for insomnia, cough and colds and headache, and also for treatment of morning sickness. And it was advertised in UK as it could be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on the mother or the child. It was never approved in the US by FDA. It was estimated that more than 2,000 children died because of the thalidomide. In Germany, there were more than 10,000 children born with serious birth defect, and 5,000 in West Germany. After some time, there was a paper also published in The Lancet. It was a very short notice, but it noticed that there was a very high risk of adverse effect, and the drug was finally taken off the market in 1961. In general, thalidomide changed our view on drug safety in general, but after 60 years, we still know little about drug safety in pregnancy. So the question is, where do we get information on medicines prescribed in pregnancy? Adverse outcomes are often rare, and therefore having safety studies will require large sample size. Few medications are licensed in pregnancy, but the fact is that many women are still prescribed medication in pregnancy. We have different resources, so there are cross-sectional survey. There was a study conducted, an international study, a web-based study in Norway back in 2013. There are some bespoke registries. I went into this drug registry this morning. It doesn't seem as they are collecting data anymore, but they were collecting data up to 2022. Then there are outcome registries such as EuroCat, which collect information on congenital anomalies. And then we also have electronic health records. And now I want to focus on the electronic health records. So, drug treatment in pregnancy. There are 3 types of treatment. You have the acute disease event in pregnancy, infections, acute pain. You have pregnancy-related conditions, so morning sickness and supplements. And then you have long-term condition, depression, epilepsy, asthma, chronic pain. And we want to examine the adverse effect. And here I have a few examples of my own research, and I think I should actually say our own research, because you never do this work on your own. You always work in teams, and you work with people with different expertise. But a lot of the work we have done is based on primary care electronic health records. So in UK, it would be the Clinical Practice Research Data Link or the Health Improvement Network, which are both primary care electronic health records. I have to say that the data are recorded for patient management and not research. There are demographic information on sex, deprivation, date of birth. We have longitudinal records. We have clinical records, so diagnosis and symptoms are recorded with READ codes, and more recently with SNOMED codes. We have data on prescriptions, and we have data on test results. So, within the pregnancy cohort, we have generated mother-child cohorts. So we link the mother and the child. And we have data from around 1995 and onwards. And we now have several millions of women and their children. I'm just going to give you a few examples of work we have done. So we have, for example, been looking at antibiotic treatment in pregnancy. Do women receive more or less antibiotic in pregnancy? What do you think? Any guess? Less? And is antibiotic treatment associated with adverse outcome? No. Okay. So this is a study we did some time ago. We had around 115,000 women who gave live birth. About 1 in 3 women received at least 1 antidepressant prescription in pregnancy. And we found that young age and social deprivation was associated with increased prescribing. So then on to the question about whether they received more or less antibiotics. Here we did a self-control case series. So women served as their own control. Instead of asking who received treatment, we asked when do they receive treatment. And we published this again, it's quite a while ago. So the exposure period was a pregnancy, and the unexposed period was baseline, which started exactly 1 year before the pregnancy started. And our outcome was number of antibiotics prescriptions. And we were able this way to account for seasonality and also fixed confounding such as ethnicity, social deprivation, etc. And overall, there was less antibiotics prescribed in pregnancy compared to similar period before. So our incidence rate ratio was 0.91, so about 10% less. But that is not the whole story, because it very much depends on what type of antibiotics. So what you can see here is that broad-spectrum penicillin, I should say the line, that would be the vertical line, is 1. So if it's to the, what would that be for you? Would that be to your left? It means that they were prescribed less. On the other hand, if to your right, it means that they were prescribed more. So for example, broad-spectrum penicillin was prescribed more often in pregnancy. And similar, we also know that, for example, urinary tract infections are more common in pregnancy, and they are also often prescribed antibiotics. Then on to the question about antibiotics, whether it's associated with adverse outcome. And there was a large randomized trial which suggested that there was an association. And we were curious to find out if we could replicate this with data from clinical practice. And here we were looking at association between antibiotic prescribing in pregnancy and the risk of cerebral palsy or epilepsy. So we did a cohort study of nearly 200,000 women linked to the live-term born singleton children. And children were followed up to the age of 7 years. And we adjusted for smoking, social deprivation, and chronic condition. So overall, we found that there was no association between antibiotics prescribed in pregnancy. We found a hazard ratio of 1.04. However, if we compared one type of antibiotics, macrolide, with the penicillin, so they were both prescribed a type of antibiotics, then we found an increase of cerebral palsy or epilepsy associated with macrolide. And then it is good to know that macrolide is actually one of the drugs that is prescribed far less in pregnancy, whereas the broad-spectrum penicillin is prescribed more commonly. So we now move on, because now we start to look at antidepressants. And there are hundreds of studies on antidepressants treatment in pregnancy. And it is confusing. Some studies suggest a small effect on specific drugs, on specific outcomes, whereas other studies suggest no effect. It's observational data we are working with. And if you go into these studies, and I have done, there are studies where they are doing hundreds of tests. And you would have learned in the last couple of weeks that if you do 100 tests, there is a good chance that a few of them will come up significant. And there are some papers where they then focus on the sub study, and they find that there is a significant result, and that is a key finding in their abstract, despite that they do not find an overall effect. So the question is, who do we compare against? If we compare against women not on antidepressants, or we compare against women who stopped antidepressants before they became pregnant, it may give us quite some different results. What we also should be aware of is that a lot of women stop treatment of antidepressants before or when they know that they're pregnant. So this study, we started here, I think it was 3 months before they became pregnant, and then we followed them, and we could see by the start of the pregnancy, 47% continued treatment, while women who were not pregnant, 65% would continue antidepressant at that point. But by the end of the pregnancy, only 10% of women would still be on antidepressant treatment. So in other words, pregnancy is a major determinant for discontinuation, not only of antidepressants. We also found it for many other psychotropic medication. So the burning question is, women who take antidepressants, would they have a lower risk of outcome? Why? Had they not taken antidepressants? It sounds very simple, but it is tricky when we cannot randomize women to treatment. So one solution may be to compare the risk between different groups of women and to do what we call a comparative study. And we did that. So we had women who were prescribed one type of antidepressants, SSRI, in the first trimester, some women who were not on antidepressants, other women on other antidepressants, and women who were on treatment before but not in pregnancy. And we did not find a major difference between any of these groups. But we did look into their risk factors, and we did find that the women who were diabetics, women who had alcohol problems, women who were on illicit drugs, who were obese, had an increased risk of congenital malformation. We did not find an effect of smoking. So our study suggests that there was no association between SSRI exposure in first trimester and congenital heart anomalies. On the other hand, we found associations between other factors such as diabetes, history of alcohol, illicit drug use, obesity, and AIDS and congenital heart anomalies. So what we end up concluding is that advising women to stop antidepressants in pregnancy could be counterproductive, and it could have severe consequences for both the mother and the child. Okay. It is time to gain a little bit of an overview of the strengths and the limitations of electronic health records. As you have seen, some studies with very large sample size. You have seen examples of population and questions that would be difficult to study otherwise. And it is a picture of clinical practice, what happens in real life. So I think these are some of the major strengths. But a strength can also be a limitation. So it is clinical practice, it is real life. There is a question sometimes about representativeness. There is a issue around sensitivity and specificity, and there is the major elephant in the room, confounding. There are other issues as well, but I only have an hour, so I can't cover it all. So we have the point that it is clinical practice, it's real life. The data are made for clinical management and not for research. There is a major issue often on missing data on health indicators, and we have to be very much aware it is records of clinical consultations, so we cannot estimate population prevalence or incidence. Oh, let's come twice. There we go. So there's also another thing we really need to be aware of. So for example, when you're using Danish registry data or you read papers based on Danish registry data, they are based on hospital data. There will also be data on prescribing, and there will be data on lab results. But they do not have information from primary care, or they have limited data from primary care. UK electronic health record is primarily around primary care, but there is also some secondary care records linked. But common for both of the data, we have to be aware of the setting where the data comes from. But it is not all systems that are representative of the general population. And this is particularly an issue for systems that are based on health insurance. For example, some of the American databases are very much collected on records from, for example, a specific population, and you cannot generalize from that population to the whole population. And especially I noticed during COVID, there were studies coming out from some of these insurance or health claims databases where you thought, hang on, there's something wrong. These results are not related to the general population. So whenever you read a study or whenever you want to conduct a study, the first question would be to look at how do these data represent the general population. Then, just a second. Then there is a question about sensitivity versus specificity. And electronic health records may not capture all diseases or events. So in general, we have a low sensitivity, but many validation studies that there is a high specificity. So actually, if you have a record in electronic health record that suggests you have diabetes, it is very likely that you have diabetes. But we may not have captured everybody with diabetes. And here I give an example of not all individuals with low mood go to their doctors, and not all with a depression get a record of depression, and very few individuals with depression are seen in secondary care. And we need to be aware of that when we study, for example, depression in electronic health records. So, yeah, I've said that already, and this has an implication for research. So estimates are not community incidence prevalence, but indication of clinical practice. And the other thing we need to be aware of, and sometimes it's becoming very common to talk about a common data model, and then we study the same question in different countries or in different healthcare settings. The problem is that if we are using data from different parts of the healthcare system, we cannot directly compare the results we have in these common data model. And we also have to be careful about how we define our study population, because we have different code systems. Some countries would use ICD-10 codes, others would use READ codes, and some would use SNOMED. And we have to consider whether to include symptom codes as well as diagnostic codes, and consider whether to include treatment, or, for example, prescriptions or other treatment. Here it is really paramount that we have knowledge of the healthcare system. So this is a study that we published a long time ago on depression. So we were looking at incidence of depression in UK primary care. And if we take the lower line, it looks as it's going up. And if we take the middle line, it looks as it's going down. And if we take the combined line at the top, it looks as it's almost the same. Any suggestion to what the difference is between the upper and the lower line? The lower one is symptoms. So recording of symptoms is going up. Recording of diagnosis is going down. So if you define your cases solely on diagnosis, your results would suggest that depression is going down. If you define your cases solely on symptom codes, it would suggest it goes up. It's just an example of how important it is to consider how you define or make your case definition. Then finally to confounding. It is a major issue in electronic health records research. Yes, we can control some of them by regression or by design, but in particular confounding by indication is a major issue. So what is confounding by indication? When the reason for treatment is related to the patient's prognosis, the study may be subject to confounding by indication. And I want to give you an example from my own research, or our own research, because we did learn the hard way. So we wanted to emulate a randomized controlled trial to real life. So we wanted to replicate the RILES trial on spironolactone for treatment of heart failure. So we identified people with severe heart failure, and I don't know how many hours we spent on developing this propensity score for spironolactone treatment. We had many meetings, we had clinicians, we had statisticians, we had epidemiologists, and we had a long list, and we developed the most wonderful propensity score. And we matched individuals with and without treatment, and we estimated the relative survival using a Cox model. Yeah. And people treated with spironolactone had the same chance of survival after 24 months as those who were treated in the RILES trial. So that was good. But people with heart failure, but not treated, had an even better survival. So we looked at the relative risk of mortality in people treated with spironolactone, and we found a hazard ratio in the RILES trial of 0.7. And then we did our study, and we found the opposite. So if you were treated with spironolactone, you had a higher risk of dying. I asked the statistician, are you sure you have not switched the two groups around? And he said, yes, I am very sure. And then we had long discussion, what do we do next? And then we wrote to BMJ and said, will you publish this not as the result as they are, but as a warning to other people about confounding by indication? And we did that. So we found the RILES trial here. We had then our overall propensity score matched analysis. And then if we took different quantiles, we saw that the effect moved a bit around. You can read the paper yourself in BMJ, but I think it serves as a good warning that confounding by indication is not going to go away, even with the best propensity score in the world. So I think the lessons we learned here is that no treatment in clinical practice is not the same as placebo in randomized controlled trials. And therefore we need to look into alternative design, for example an active comparator design or self-controlled case series may sometimes be an option. But no single study design may provide a full answer. And there it is, I want to highlight the idea of triangulation. And you have several approaches design, and you compare the results of these designs. So some of you may remember from when you went to high school, you learned a little bit about triangulation, that if you were to measure the distance out to that ship, you needed to have different points of view, and then you would look at the angle, and then you could estimate the real distance. And Deborah Lawlor, who is also here on this course, have written a wonderful paper on triangulation in etiological epidemiology. And I would strongly recommend that paper. So it is the practice of strengthening causal inference by integrating results from several different approaches, where each approach has different and assumed to be largely unrelated key sources of potential bias. So the idea is actually very different from when we do systematic reviews, where we want to have study designs to be as similar as possible. Here we actually want quite the opposite, looking at study designs that are very different and compare these results against each other. So, the future of epidemiological research. I think that epidemiological research is likely to be centered around electronic health records. And they have potential to change clinical practice, but we need ways to optimize the use of electronic health records. I don't have the answer, but I do believe that AI may play a significant role in that. I'm not saying we should hand it over to AI, but I think we should learn to use AI in an intelligent way. For example, we can use AI to generate our first code list. Then we can interact and we can see, okay, does that make sense? We can use AI to develop individual level risk prediction models. These are just two examples of where we may be able to use AI in electronic health record research epidemiology. We also need to accept there are limitations, and there are studies that we cannot do using electronic health records. And then I would like to say a warm thanks to many of my colleagues and students who have been on this journey and maybe this bike with me, and I'm looking forward to continue that journey. Thank you.